Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Endgame Essentials. Now, do you all remember at the beginning of the video where I featured opposite colored bishops? In the middle game I said, in the endgame you don't really want to get opposite colored bishops if you are on the winning side. Because with opposite colored bishops, the defending side can just play on the color of their bishop and you can never contest, because the bishops are on opposite colors. So it just becomes very difficult to break fortresses even if you have two pawns up. Some crazy endgames are still drawn. Well, today I will be explaining that idea. So in the position we have here, we have opposite colored bishops and whites actually up at 2 pawns. Now this position looks easily winning for white because he's up 2 pawns. How is this not winning? Well, the position is actually drawn because the defending side can create holds on the color of his bishop, but the attacker can never contest that color because his bishop is a different color than the opponent's. Now the only way you can win opposite colored bishop endgames is to overwhelm the king. You have to overwhelm the defender's king to win opposite colored bishop endgames, and I'll show you that idea later. But let's just see why this position is drawn. So this position is drawn because, first of all, the king blockades this c-pawn. And if white tries to advance his e-pawn with king to f6, black can just wait. He will just wait for the pawn to come close enough, and then now the drawing move is king to d8. And now look what happens. This bishop and king work together to create a bind on e7, so you cannot advance e7. This king also guards c7, and there's no way white can advance any of his pawns. If you play king f7 just waiting, black will wait too. So here, if you try to move c7, deflecting the king away from the e7 square, the problem is I can just take on c7, and after e7, I can sacrifice my bishop, because after king takes e7, this is a draw due to insufficient mating material. You cannot mate with a lone bishop. So this is why opposite colored bishops against pawns that are only one file apart are drawn, because the king is not overloaded yet. So let's see if the king will get overloaded when they're 2 files apart. So now I brought up the position where the pawns are separated by 2 files. They're separated by a D and a C file. And as you can see, this bishop kind of covers both the advancing pawn's squares. So in this position, if white tries to play king d4 to advance this e4 pawn, black can just respond with king f5, preventing that, because this bishop and the king both hold e4. So instead, king b5 should be played, but the problem is after king to d7, king a6, attempting to push b7, king c8. And now this bishop and king both hold b7. So if white waits, black also waits. If you play king b5, attempting to go back here and advance e4, black can just follow with king to d7. After king c5, king e6, king d4, king f5. So as you can see, if the pawns are 2 files apart, it's still not enough to overwhelm the defending side's king. So on to the next example, where the pawns are connected or 0 files apart. Now here I've loaded up the position with connected pawns. So with connected pawns, opposite color bishop endgames are drawn. If 2 files wasn't enough to overwhelm the king, 0 files should not be enough either. The reason why people think connected passed pawns would make a difference is because normally connected pawns in any other endgame would be stronger. But in opposite color bishop endgames, that's not the case. It's a draw. So let's just say after d5, you play king to d6. After bishop f4 check, you play king to d7. And on e5, here's the key move, bishop to f7. Now, you cannot play e6 here because on bishop takes e6, d takes e6, and king takes e6, this is drawn because there's insufficient mating material. So instead on bishop f7, if white plays king to d4, just protecting this e4 pawn, the problem is bishop to g8. And there's no way to make progress here. If you try something like d6, the thing is bishop to e6, and now the pawns can never advance because black has a permanent hold on e6. After king e4, bishop h3, you just keep waiting. King d5, you play check, king e4, and then you just keep waiting. So instead of d6, maybe e6. But then here's the problem. You sack the bishop. Same line as before, insufficient mating material. On bishop to g8, if you wait, black will also wait. There's just no way that you can break this hold. So that's why this endgame is drawn. So now that we know that 0 files, 1 file, and 2 files are not enough to overwhelm the defending side's king, let's see if 3 files is enough. So now I've loaded up the position where the pawns are separated by 3 files, an e file, a d file, and a c file. So as a general rule of thumb, if the pawns are separated by more than 2 files, it is a win for the attacker because the king just cannot switch its power between both pawns quick enough, so therefore it becomes overloaded. So let's just see this in action. So white starts off the position with b7. You don't want to play something like king d4 because of bishop f2. And this skewers the king and the pawn, and wins the pawn and draws the game for black. So instead you move the pawn first, and after king b8 only then do you play king to d4. So what this tries to do is to bring the king to e4 and assist in advancing this pawn. So bishop d6 and king e4. Now black's king needs to come out of b8 because if you just continue waiting with bishop to c7, white will just advance the pawn and just eventually you're going to have to give up the bishop for the pawn, and this will be an easy win for white. So instead, on king e4, you don't wait, and black has to get his king out with king to c7. So white continues to advance his pawn after king d7, king f5, king e7, and king g5, which gets out of the way of the pawn, so the pawn can easily advance. Of course, you don't play king to g6 because that blunders your f pawn. So king g5, bishop to b8, f5, continuing to advance the pawn after bishop e5 and king to g6. Now in this position, whatever black plays, he is going to lose control of one of the key squares, f6 or b8, because this bishop needs to retain on this exact square to control both of those squares. And this king needs to stay here to control this f6 square. So once one of them has to move, they will lose control of one of the squares. So this is a concept known as Zugzwang. So of course you don't give up b8, because if you give up b8, then white will immediately get a new queen and win the game. So bishop to d6. But now that gives up f6, so white is free to play f6 check. After king f8, you can play f7. After something like bishop c7, king f5, and basically all you have to do is queen this guy and win the bishop. So that's what white is going to do. And you queen the pawn next move, and you easily win the game. So this is what I mean by the king being overloaded. The king just can't switch between both pawns quick enough to distribute its power and blockade both of them. So that's why if the pawns are separated by more than 2 files, it's generally a win. So now I have the final example I've prepared for today, and this position looks winning for white. I mean, the pawns are separated by more than 2 files. In fact, they're separated by 4 files. So this surely is winning for white, right? Because the king will be overloaded if you distribute the power between the 2 pawns. And the answer is yes, the king will be overloaded. But there's a catch in this position. We have a rook pawn, and you guys know that rook pawns have very big drawing tendencies. Once you realize that there's a rook pawn, you should always look at the corner color and look at the bishop color. And you notice that they are different. The bishop is dark, the corner color is light. So with that realization, you can safely play king to c7, knowing that after king e4, you just rush into the corner. And after f5, you can sacrifice your bishop for the pawn, and after king takes f5, king to a8, and this is a draw. Now, if you don't know why this is a draw, I made a video about it. I'll put a card up in the top right-hand corner. Click on that if you want to understand why this is a draw. So I hope this video helps you understand opposite color bishop endgames better, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.